The dust-laden wind swept across the plains of Cottonwood Creek, Texas, carrying whispers of a woman who dared to claim her own destiny in a land where most women belonged to men. Fiona Zimmerman stood on her porch, Winchester rifle propped against the weathered railing, watching the horizon with eyes as sharp as the afternoon sun. It was 1876, and while most respectable women her age were tending to husbands and children, Fiona had chosen a different path, one that led to 20 acres of land on the outskirts of town, where she answered to no one but herself. The townspeople called her peculiar, some even whispered witch when she passed by with her basket of herbs, but Fiona paid them no mind. At 28, she had buried both parents, nursed wounded soldiers during the war, and traveled alone from Pennsylvania to stake her claim in the Texas territory. She had earned her solitude and her independence. Fiona's cabin was modest but sturdy, built with her own hands and the reluctant help of a few kind souls who couldn't bear to see a woman struggle, regardless of how improper they found her situation. Her garden stretched behind the house, yielding vegetables and medicinal herbs that she sometimes sold or traded in town. A small stable housed her mare Penny and a stubborn old mule named Jasper. The land around her property remained wild and untamed, a fact that caused the town marshal no small amount of concern. Cottonwood Creek was growing, and with growth came troubled drifters, outlaws, and desperate men who saw a woman living alone as an easy target. "Miss Zimmerman," Marshal Collins had said just last week, tipping his hat as she loaded supplies into her wagon, "it ain't safe for a lady on her own out there. Been reports of the Dalton gang moving through these parts." "I appreciate your concern, Marshal," Fiona had replied, her voice polite but firm, "but I've managed just fine these past 3 years." The Marshal had shaken his head. "Pride's a luxury you might not be able to afford much longer." Now, as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, Fiona thought about the Marshal's words. She wasn't foolish enough to think herself invincible, but the freedom of her solitude was worth the risk. She'd rather die on her own terms than live by someone else's. The sound of approaching hooves pulled her from her thoughts. Instinctively, her hand moved to the rifle. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. The rider approached slowly, deliberately, as if giving her time to see him coming. The stranger sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. As he drew closer, Fiona could make out a strong jawline beneath the shadow of his hat. "Evening, madam," he called out, stopping his horse a respectful distance from her porch. "Name's Ethan Daniels." "Marshal Collins in town said I might find work out this way." Fiona's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "Marshal Collins should mind his own business. I didn't send for any help." The stranger Ethan nodded as if he'd expected this response. "He mentioned you might say that." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Also said you're the most stubborn woman in 3 counties. Despite herself, Fiona felt the slightest tug of amusement. "The Marshal's got a loose tongue. He's concerned," Ethan replied, his tone serious now. "Said there's been trouble moving through these parts. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands to secure your property." "And he sent you?" Fiona raised an eyebrow. "I don't know you, Mr. Daniels." "Fair enough." Ethan dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. Up close, Fiona could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or 32, with keen eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were worn but clean, and the calluses on his hands spoke of hard work. "I came west from Tennessee after the war," he explained. "Been working cattle drives, ranch hands, whatever honest work I could find. Last outfit I was with sold their herd and land to the railroad. I'm looking for something more permanent." "I can't pay much," Fiona said, surprising herself. She hadn't decided to hire him, had she? "I'm not asking for much," Ethan replied. "A fair wage for fair work. I can build, repair, tend livestock, and I'm handy with this." He gestured to the revolver holstered at his hip. Fiona studied him, weighing her options. The truth was, there was work she couldn't manage alone: repairs to the roof before winter, clearing new ground for planting, and yes, perhaps some additional security wouldn't be amiss. Still, she'd built this life to be free of men and their demands. 1 week, she said finally. I'll give you work for 1 week. After that, we'll see. Relief crossed his features, quickly replaced by a businesslike nod. That's fair, thank you, Miss Zimmerman. You can sleep in the stable, she said. There's a small room attached with a cot. Previous owner kept a hand there from time to time. That'll do just fine. As Ethan led his horse toward the stable, Fiona couldn't help but watch him go. There was something in his manner that didn't quite fit with the cowboys and drifters who occasionally passed through, a quietness, perhaps. A sense of purpose beyond the next drink or card game. She told herself it didn't matter. 1 week and he'd be gone. The next morning, Fiona rose before dawn as was her custom. She fed her chickens and milked her cow in the dim light of early morning, expecting to be alone with her thoughts as always. She was startled to find Ethan already at work, splitting logs by the woodpile. "You're up early, Mr. Daniels," she called, setting down her milk pail. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "Old habits. Army doesn't let you sleep past sunrise. You fought in the war?" Fiona asked, suddenly curious. A shadow crossed his face. "Yes, madam, Union cavalry. I served as a nurse in field hospitals near Gettysburg." She didn't elaborate and he didn't ask. Some memories were best left undisturbed. "I've made a list," Fiona said, changing the subject. "Things that need doing around the property. When you're finished with the wood, I'll show you." Ethan nodded. "I took the liberty of riding the perimeter this morning. Your southeast corner could use some attention. Fence is down in places." "I've been meaning to get to it," Fiona said defensively. "No doubt," Ethan replied, his tone neutral. "It's a lot for one person to maintain." "I've managed." "Yes, madam, I can see that." They worked separately that morning, Fiona in her garden, Ethan repairing the chicken coop and splitting more wood. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and Fiona called him to the house for a meal. "It's nothing fancy," she said, setting out bread, cheese, and cold ham on the porch table. She wouldn't invite him inside. That seemed too familiar for a hired hand she barely knew. "Looks like a feast to me," Ethan said, settling onto the bench across from her. "Been eating my own cooking for too long." "You never married?" Fiona asked before she could stop herself. If the question surprised him, he didn't show it. "No, almost did before the war, Mary Ellen Prescott. She couldn't wait for me, though, can't blame her." 4 years is a long time, and there was no guarantee I'd come back. "I'm sorry," Fiona said, meaning it. Ethan shrugged. "It was for the best. I came back different. We all did." He took a bite of bread. "And you chose this life." "I did," Fiona said firmly. "My father left me enough to start somewhere new after he passed. Most people thought I should find a husband, but—" She trailed off. "But you wanted something that was yours alone," Ethan finished. Fiona looked at him sharply. "Yes." "Nothing wrong with that," he said simply, and returned to his meal. That afternoon, Ethan began work on the fence. Fiona watched from her garden as he loaded posts and tools onto a small wagon hitched to her mule. There was an efficiency to his movements that spoke of experience and careful thought. "I'll be back before sundown," he called to her. "Take Jasper's water bucket," she replied. "It's hot out there and he's stubborn about thirst." Ethan tipped his hat in acknowledgement and set off toward the southeast corner of her property. Fiona turned back to her tomato plants, trying to ignore the strange feeling of having another person working her land, making decisions about her property. It had been just her for so long. That evening, Ethan returned as promised, covered in dust and sweat but with a satisfied set to his shoulders. "Got about a quarter of the fence repaired," he reported. "Should finish the south line tomorrow." Fiona nodded. "That's good progress." "I was thinking," he said carefully, "it might be wise to build the new sections higher, more secure." "Higher? Why?" "Just a precaution. Makes it harder for anyone to climb over or for cattle to wander through." Fiona considered this. "How much more lumber would we need?" "Not much." "I can cut some from that stand of pine on your western edge if you're agreeable." "Fine," she said, "but don't take more than necessary. I like those trees." Ethan smiled slightly. "Yes, madam." Over the next few days, a rhythm developed between them. They would share a simple breakfast at dawn, discuss the day's work. Then go their separate ways, Fiona to her garden or household tasks, Ethan to the fence or other repairs. They would meet again for the midday meal, exchange a few words, then return to work until dusk brought them together for supper on the porch. Fiona found herself looking forward to these quiet meals more than she cared to admit. Ethan was not one for idle chatter, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful, sometimes unexpectedly humorous. He told her about the places he'd seen in his travels: the red rocks of the Arizona Territory, the towering forests of Oregon, the bustling streets of San Francisco. "You've been all over," Fiona remarked on the fourth evening as they watched lightning flicker in distant clouds. "Couldn't seem to settle," Ethan admitted. "Kept thinking the next place might be the one that felt right." "And did you find it?" He glanced at her, then back at the horizon. "Not yet, but I've stopped looking so hard." On the fifth day, Ethan didn't return for the midday meal. Fiona tried not to worry. He was a grown man, perfectly capable of taking care of himself, but by mid-afternoon, a knot of concern had formed in her stomach. She was debating whether to saddle Penny and go looking for him when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She grabbed her rifle and positioned herself on the porch. Heart pounding, 3 riders came into view. Ethan rode in front, his expression grim. Behind him were 2 men she didn't recognize, their hands bound to their saddle horns. "Miss Zimmerman," Ethan called as they approached. "Found these 2 gentlemen cutting through your fence line. Thought you might want to have a word before I take them to the marshal." The men looked rough and trail-worn. One had a fresh bruise blooming on his jaw. "We wasn't doing nothing wrong," the taller one protested. "Just taking a shortcut with wire cutters," Ethan asked mildly, holding up the tool in question. "We got lost," the second man muttered. Fiona stepped forward, rifle ready but not aimed directly at the men. "This is private property, gentlemen, not a public thoroughfare." "Didn't see no signs," the first man argued. "You saw the fence," Ethan countered. "Hard to miss, especially when you're cutting through it." Fiona studied the men more carefully. They didn't look like part of an organized gang, more like opportunists. Still, they had been trespassing and with tools meant for breaking in. "What were you really after?" she asked. The men exchanged glances but said nothing. "There's rumors in town," Ethan said quietly to Fiona, "about a woman living alone with a fortune hidden on her property." Fiona almost laughed. "A fortune? Is that what they're saying?" "Yes, madam. Seems some folks can't imagine why else a woman would choose to live out here alone." "Well, gentlemen," Fiona addressed the would-be thieves, "I'm afraid you've been misled. There's no fortune here, just hard work and a woman's right to live as she chooses." "What do you want to do with them?" Ethan asked her, his tone making it clear the decision was hers. Fiona considered. Sending them to the marshal would mean charges, a trial, possibly prison. It would also mean she'd have to go to town, make statements, possibly face a hostile courtroom. "Let them go," she decided. Ethan looked surprised. "Miss Zimmerman, but first," Fiona continued, "they can repair the section of fence they damaged, properly. Under your supervision, Mr. Daniels." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Yes, madam." The 2 men grumbled, but facing the alternative of jail, agreed to the terms. Ethan untied their hands but kept their horses' reins, making it clear escape wasn't an option. For the rest of the afternoon, Fiona watched from a distance as Ethan instructed the men in rebuilding the section of fence they had damaged. He was firm but not cruel, and by sunset, the fence was repaired better than it had been before. "You can go," Fiona told the men as they finished. "But spread the word there's no fortune here and the next trespassers won't get off so easy." After the men had ridden away, Ethan turned to her. "That was merciful of you," Fiona shrugged. "Justice seemed better served by having them fix what they broke." "And the warning, do you think they'll heed it?" Ethan considered. "Hard to say, but word will spread that your place isn't as vulnerable as they thought." That night, after a quiet supper, Ethan remained on the porch while Fiona cleared the dishes. When she returned, she found him gazing at the stars, a pensive look on his face. "Tomorrow's the last day of our agreement," he said without looking at her. Fiona felt an unexpected pang at his words. "Yes, the fence will be finished. I've repaired the roof and the chicken coop. The stable door no longer sticks." You've done good work, Fiona acknowledged. Ethan turned to face her. I'd like to stay on if you're agreeable. There's more that could be done to make this place secure. And winter's coming, you'll need firewood, repairs to the root cellar, maybe a new well pump. Fiona studied him in the dim light of her kerosene lamp. Why, Mr. Daniels, why here? You could find work on any ranch in the territory, better paying work. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I've worked for men who care only about profit, not the land or the people who tend it. I've seen what greed does to good land. He gestured to the darkness beyond the porch. What you've built here, it's honest. It has purpose beyond money. It's mine, Fiona said simply. Yes, Ethan nodded. And you defend it not just for yourself, but for what it represents, freedom, independence. And that appeals to you, it does, he admitted. I've been wandering since the war ended, looking for something worth defending again. The honesty in his voice struck Fiona deeply. She recognized in him the same yearning for purpose that had driven her to this remote place. I can't pay you more than I've been paying, she said. I'm not asking for more money. Then what are you asking for, Mr. Daniels? A place, he said simply. Not just work, a place to belong. Fiona looked out at the dark expanse of her land. She had come here seeking solitude, freedom from the expectations and demands of others. But solitude and loneliness were not the same thing, she realized. Perhaps there was a kind of freedom in sharing this place with someone who understood its value. 2 more weeks, she said finally. We'll see how it goes. The relief on his face was evident even in the dim light. Thank you, Miss Zimmerman. Fiona, she said, surprising herself. If you're staying on, you might as well use my given name. A slow smile spread across his face. Ethan, then. 2 weeks stretched into a month, and as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Fiona found herself adapting to Ethan's presence on her land. He was true to his word, working tirelessly to improve the property, never overstepping the boundaries she set, and gradually becoming an unexpectedly comfortable part of her daily life. The fence around her property was completed, higher and sturdier than before. Ethan had incorporated a gate at the main entrance, with a clever locking mechanism he'd designed himself. It's not just about keeping trouble out, he explained as he showed her how it worked. It's about choice, knowing who comes in and when. Fiona appreciated his understanding. The fence wasn't a prison. It was a boundary that she controlled. As they worked side by side preparing for winter smoking meat, preserving vegetables from the garden, stacking firewood, Fiona found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone. About her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's progressive views on education for women, her mother's quiet strength in the face of neighbors' disapproval. She taught me to make soap, Fiona told Ethan one evening as they sat shelling peas on the porch. Not just ordinary soap, but special blends with herbs for different purposes. The women who whispered about her strange ways behind her back would still come to her when they needed something to ease chilblains or heal a rash. Sounds like you take after her, Ethan observed, nodding toward the drying herbs hanging from the porch rafters. In some ways, Fiona agreed. Though she would never have done this, she gestured to the property around them. She believed in a woman's strength, but within the bounds of convention. And you? I believe conventions are often made by those who benefit from them, not those who must live by them. Ethan's eyes crinkled with amusement. I can't argue with that. In turn, he shared pieces of his own past, not all at once, but in quiet moments when the work was done and the evening stretched before them. He told her about growing up in eastern Tennessee, his father a blacksmith, his mother a schoolteacher who had insisted her sons learn to read and cipher. He spoke of his younger brother, lost at Shiloh, of the farm he had hoped to start before the war changed everything. What I wanted then seems impossible now, he admitted one night as the first frost crystallized on the grass. Not just because of what I've seen, but because of who I've become. And who is that? Fiona asked, wrapped in a shawl against the chill. Ethan considered the question. A man who understands that peace is worth more than ambition. As winter settled over Cottonwood Creek, the rhythm of life on Fiona's homestead adjusted to the season. The days grew shorter, the work focused more on repairs and indoor tasks. Ethan moved from the stable room to a small cabin he built near the main house, close enough for security, but separate enough to maintain propriety. For Christmas, he surprised her with a rocking chair he had crafted in secret, using wood from her own land and techniques he had learned from his father. "It's beautiful," Fiona said, running her hand over the smooth armrests. "Every homestead needs a proper rocking chair," Ethan said with a hint of shyness she rarely saw in him. For evenings when the work is done, Fiona had made him a new coat, lined with wool and carefully stitched to withstand the Texas winters, which could be surprisingly harsh. "This is too fine for work," he protested when he unwrapped it. "Then save it for Sundays," she replied. "When you go to town." He looked at her curiously. "Will you come with me sometime to town?" Fiona hesitated. She rarely went to Cottonwood Creek except for supplies, and even then she felt the stares and whispers of the townspeople. "Perhaps," she said noncommittally. January brought a fierce storm that howled across the plains for 3 days, piling snow against the fence and testing the repairs they had made to the roof. On the second night, when the wind was at its worst, Fiona woke to the sound of the barn door banging. Without hesitation, she pulled on her boots and coat over her nightdress and grabbed the lantern. Outside, the snow was blinding, the wind cutting through her layers like a knife. She struggled toward the barn, worried about Penny and the cow. Halfway there, a figure emerged from the swirling snow. Ethan, his shoulders hunched against the storm. "Get back inside," he shouted over the wind. "I'll secure the barn," but Fiona was already beside him, holding the lantern high. "We'll do it together." Together, they fought their way to the barn, where they found the door had broken free from one of its hinges. The animals inside were nervous but unharmed. Working side by side, they managed to rehang the door and secure it with rope until repairs could be made. As they made their way back toward the house, Ethan suddenly stopped. "Listen," above the howl of the wind, Fiona heard it, a high, thin cry. "What is that?" she asked, straining to see through the snow. "I don't know." Ethan took the lantern from her. "Stay here, I'll check." "No," Fiona said firmly, taking back the lantern. "My land, my responsibility." The look he gave her was equal parts exasperation and admiration. "Stubborn woman, at least stay behind me." They moved toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from near the fence line. As they drew closer, the beam of the lantern illuminated a dark shape huddled against the posts. It was a woman, barely conscious, her clothes inadequate for the storm. Beside her, wrapped in what appeared to be the woman's shawl, was a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. "Help us," the woman whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Please." Ethan immediately removed his coat and wrapped it around the woman. Fiona did the same for the child, who was frightened but alert. "We need to get them inside," Fiona shouted over the storm. Ethan nodded, already lifting the woman in his arms. Fiona picked up the child, who clung to her neck with surprising strength. The journey back to the house seemed endless, but finally they stumbled through the door into the blessed warmth of Fiona's kitchen. Ethan laid the woman gently on the sofa while Fiona set the child down near the stove. "I'll get blankets," Fiona said, handing Ethan the lantern. When she returned with an armful of quilts, Ethan was kneeling beside the woman, speaking to her softly. The child had climbed onto the sofa and was clutching the woman's hand. "Her name is Sarah," Ethan told Fiona. "The boy is her son, Thomas. They were traveling with a wagon train but got separated in the storm 2 days ago." 2 days, Fiona exclaimed, wrapping a quilt around the shivering child. "How did they survive?" "Found an overturned wagon," Sarah whispered, her voice weak. "Sheltered there, but food ran out, saw your light, tried to reach it." "You're safe now," Fiona assured her, already moving to prepare hot broth and tea. For the next several hours, Fiona and Ethan worked together to care for their unexpected guests. Sarah was suffering from exposure and exhaustion, but began to improve after warm food and rest. Little Thomas, resilient as only children can be, was soon sitting up in a nest of blankets, shyly accepting the cornbread and honey Fiona offered. As the storm continued to rage outside, Fiona prepared her bedroom for Sarah and Thomas, insisting they take the more comfortable space. "Where will you sleep?" Ethan asked as they stood in the kitchen, voices low to avoid waking the exhausted pair. "I'll make a pallet here by the stove," Fiona replied. Ethan frowned. "Take my cabin, I'll stay here." "Don't be ridiculous, your cabin is 50 yards away through a blizzard." "Then I'll take the pallet, you can have the chair." Fiona looked at the rocking chair he had made her, considering. "We'll take shifts," she decided. 4 hours each, that way we can keep the fire going all night. Ethan nodded, accepting the compromise. "I'll take first watch." As Fiona settled into the rocking chair, wrapped in a quilt, she watched Ethan add wood to the stove. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, solid, dependable, yet never imposing. He had become, she realized with a start, essential to her peace of mind. The thought should have frightened her. She had built this life to need no one, but instead, it settled in her heart like a warm coal. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan looked up, questioning. "For being here tonight," she clarified. "I couldn't have brought them in alone." "You'd have found a way," he said with certainty. "But I'm glad I was here to help." The storm lasted another full day before finally releasing its grip on the plains. When it cleared, the world outside was transformed drifts of snow piled against the fence, trees bowed under white blankets, the land peaceful in its winter sleep. Sarah grew stronger, though she worried constantly about the rest of her party. They were headed for the settlement at Willow Creek, she explained as Fiona changed the bandages on her frostbitten fingers. "My husband's brother has land there. After James died of the fever in Kansas, I decided to continue on with Thomas." "That's very brave," Fiona said. Sarah shook her head. "Not brave, desperate. There was nothing left for us back east." Ethan rode to town as soon as the trails were passable, carrying a message to the marshal about the lost wagon train. He returned with news that searchers had found the main party, safe but concerned about their missing members. "They've made camp at Forrester's Ranch, about 15 miles north," he reported. "They'll wait there until Sarah and Thomas are well enough to travel." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "Thank God, I feared they might have continued on without us." "Folks stick together out here," Ethan said. "It's how we survive." Though we didn't escape Fiona's notice, somewhere along the way, Ethan had stopped being a drifter and started seeing himself as part of this place. Sarah and Thomas stayed for another week, until Sarah's strength returned and the trails became more passable. During that time, the small cabin was filled with a domestic warmth Fiona had never experienced before. A child's laughter, women's voices sharing stories over tea, Ethan entertaining Thomas with whittled animals and tall tales. The morning they were to leave, Sarah found Fiona alone in the garden, checking on the winter vegetables under their protective covering of straw. "I want to thank you," Sarah said, her voice stronger now than when they had found her. "Not just for saving us, but for showing me what's possible." Fiona looked up, questioning. "A woman making her own way," Sarah clarified. "I've been so afraid since James died, wondering how I could possibly manage alone, but seeing you here, what you've built." "I'm not alone anymore," Fiona pointed out, glancing toward the cabin where Ethan was helping Thomas bundle up for the journey. Sarah smiled knowingly. "No, you're not, but you chose when and how to change that. That's what matters." As they watched Ethan with the boy, Sarah added softly, "He's a good man." "Yes," Fiona agreed, surprising herself with how easily the admission came. "He is." After Sarah and Thomas departed with 2 of the men from their wagon train who had come to escort them, a strange quiet settled over the homestead. Fiona found herself missing the bustle and noise, the constant activity of caring for others. That evening, as she and Ethan sat on the porch despite the cold, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in pinks and golds, she voiced the thought that had been growing in her mind. "I've been thinking about expanding the garden come spring, adding more medicinal herbs." Ethan nodded. "Good idea, you've got a gift for healing." "And perhaps building another room onto the house," she continued, watching him carefully. "A proper guest room," he looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "For more strays like Sarah and Thomas, perhaps. Or for anyone who needs a safe place for a while." She paused. "What do you think?" I think, Ethan said slowly, that sounds like a worthy purpose for this land, and for the fence we built around it. Our fence, Fiona corrected softly. The look he gave her then was full of such hope and quiet joy that Fiona felt something shift inside her, not a surrender of independence, but an expansion of possibility. Our fence, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. As spring breathed new life into the land, Fiona and Ethan's plans took shape. The guest room was built first, with a separate entrance and a small porch of its own. Ethan constructed a larger chicken coop and expanded the garden, adding raised beds for Fiona's herbs. Word spread, as it always does in small communities. At first, it was just Sarah, returning with Thomas to visit as they passed through on their way back east, having decided that Willow Creek wasn't for them after all. Then came a young couple whose wagon had broken an axle a mile from Fiona's gate. Then two sisters traveling to meet their husbands in California, in need of rest and fresh supplies. Each visitor left with stories of the woman on the edge of town and the cowboy who had built a fence around her land and called it safe not to keep her confined, but to create a space where she could offer shelter on her own terms. Marshall Collins, initially skeptical of the arrangement, became one of their strongest advocates. "Better than any jail cell I've got," he told Ethan after bringing a young boy he'd found sleeping in the livery stable. "Some folks just need a chance, not punishment." The boy, Jamie, stayed longer than most, almost 2 months working alongside Ethan, learning to repair tack and care for animals. When he finally left, it was with a letter of introduction to a horse breeder in San Antonio who needed an apprentice. "You've changed," Ethan observed one evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built, watching fireflies rise from the summer grass. "Not in any way that matters," he added quickly when she looked at him. "Just, you smile more." "Do I?" Fiona considered this. "I suppose having purpose beyond oneself brings a certain satisfaction." "Is that all it is? Purpose?" She knew what he was asking. Their relationship had evolved over the seasons, from employer and employee to partners in this shared mission. But there remained an unspoken boundary between them, one that neither had crossed despite the deepening bond they both felt. "No," she admitted, looking out at the land they had transformed together. "It's not just purpose." Ethan's hand found hers in the gathering dusk, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own. "I've been thinking about building my own cabin, a proper one, on the north corner of the property." Fiona's heart stuttered. "You're leaving the small cabin." "It would be better used as another guest space," he said carefully, "but I'm not going far unless—" He hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer I did." Fiona turned to face him fully. In the year since he had first ridden up to her gate, Ethan had become essential to her in ways she had never imagined possible. Not as a protector or provider, but as a companion who understood her need for independence, even as he offered his strength alongside her own. "I don't want you to go," she said, the words coming easier than she had expected. "Not to the north corner, not anywhere." The hope that blazed in his eyes took her breath away. "Fiona, I built this place to be free," she continued, "to answer to no one but myself. I never thought I could have that freedom and still share my life with someone." "You can," Ethan said fervently. "That's what I've been trying to show you. That fence we built, it's not about keeping the world out, it's about choosing who to let in." "And I choose you," Fiona whispered. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. "I love you, Fiona Zimmerman, have almost since that first day when you stood on this porch with your rifle and told me you didn't need any help." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. "I was wrong." "No," he said seriously, "you weren't. You didn't need help, but sometimes even the strongest people deserve support." Fiona leaned forward and pressed her lips to a gesture so foreign to her independent nature, yet so perfectly right in this moment. Ethan responded with a gentleness that spoke of his understanding, his respect for the magnitude of this step for her. When they finally parted, Fiona rested her forehead against his. "So, not a cabin on the north corner then?" Ethan smiled against her lips. "Perhaps an addition to this house instead, if you're amenable." "I think," Fiona said slowly, "that I am very amenable to that suggestion, Mr. Daniels." They were married in September when the prairie grasses turned golden and the first hint of autumn crispness touched the air. The ceremony was small, held on their land under an arbor Ethan had built and Fiona had covered with climbing roses. Marshal Collins officiated, Sarah and Thomas stood as witnesses, and the handful of guests included some of the travelers who had found shelter with them over the past year. Fiona wore a simple dress of deep blue with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Ethan looked almost uncomfortable in his new suit, but his eyes never left her face as they spoke their vows. Not traditional vows, Fiona had insisted during their planning. Something that reflects what we truly believe. So they promised not to possess but to support, not to lead but to walk beside, not to shelter but to strengthen. And when the marshal pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their gathered friends seemed to reach the very sky. The fence around their property remained, a boundary that defined their sanctuary but did not confine them. Over the years, it became known throughout the region as a place of refuge for women fleeing desperate situations, for children who needed temporary shelter, for travelers who had lost their way. Fiona continued to tend her garden and her herbs, developing remedies that were sought after even by the doctor in town. Ethan raised horses, specializing in gentle mounts suitable for women and children, and taught riding to those who stayed with them. They added rooms to the house as needed, but Fiona's original cabin remained the heart of their home. The porch where she had first greeted him with suspicion became their favorite place to end each day, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. 3 years after their wedding, their daughter was born, a strong-willed child they named Eleanor, after Fiona's mother. She grew up knowing the story of how her parents had met, of the fence that was built not as a barrier but as a choice. "Your mother," Ethan would tell Eleanor as they repaired posts or mended wire, "taught me that safety isn't about walls. It's about creating a place where you can be truly yourself." And Fiona, watching them work together, would remember the solitary woman she had once been, fiercely independent, determinedly self-sufficient, and ultimately incomplete. The fence still stood, marking the boundaries of what was theirs. But now it encircled not just Fiona's solitary dream, but a shared vision that had room for many dreams, many lives. On summer evenings, when the work was done and visitors had been fed and settled, Fiona and Ethan would sit on their porch, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, their hands linked as they watched the fireflies rise. And Fiona would think about the strange alchemy of love, how it could take independence and partnership and forge them into something stronger than either could be alone. She had lived alone on the edge of town. He had built a fence around her land and called it safe. And together, they had discovered that the truest safety lay not in isolation, but in the conscious choice to open their hearts and their gate. As the years passed, Cottonwood Creek grew from a small settlement into a proper town. A railroad spur line brought new businesses and settlers, and the once remote homestead found itself gradually surrounded by civilization. But the property remained somewhat apart, protected by its reputation as much as by its fence. Eleanor grew into a young woman with her mother's independence and her father's quiet strength. At 18, she announced her intention to study medicine in Boston, a declaration that filled her parents with both pride and trepidation. "Are you sure you want to go so far?" Fiona asked as they prepared Eleanor's trunk for the journey. "There are fine schools closer to home." "I'm sure," Eleanor replied, her chin set in a way that reminded Ethan forcibly of Fiona on the day they met. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell studied in the East. "If I want to be a proper physician, that's where I need to go." "Your mother is just worried," Ethan said gently. "As am I. It's a long way." Eleanor's expression softened. "I know, but you both taught me to follow my own path, and this is mine." The night before Eleanor's departure, Fiona found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and made her way to the porch. The moon was full, casting silver light over the land that had been her sanctuary for so many years. She wasn't surprised when, a few minutes later, the door opened and Ethan joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the night chill. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling beside her on the swing. "I keep thinking about the first time I saw her face," Fiona admitted. "How small she was, how completely she depended on us. And now she's heading to Boston on her own." Ethan shook his head in wonder. "We raised a brave one. Too brave, perhaps," Ethan chuckled. "That's what my father said about you when I wrote to tell him I was staying on here. That woman sounds too brave for her own good." "He wasn't wrong," Fiona said, smiling despite her anxiety. "It took a certain recklessness to build a life out here alone." "Not recklessness," Ethan corrected. "Courage, the same courage Alina is showing now." Fiona leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "When did you get so wise, Mr. Daniels?" "I had an excellent teacher, Mrs. Daniels." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west seeking independence, fighting against the constraints society placed on women. Ethan had come seeking purpose after the chaos of war. They had found each other and in doing so had created something neither could have built alone. The fence around their property had evolved over the years, repaired, extended, reinforced. It no longer served merely as protection, but as a symbol of the sanctuary they had created. Inside its boundaries, people found not just safety, but acceptance. The chance to heal, to grow, to discover their own strength. "She'll be all right," Ethan said after a while, as if reading her thoughts. "She has your determination and my caution." "God help her if she has your stubbornness," Fiona replied with a small laugh. "Says the woman who refused help until I practically forced it on her." "You never forced anything," Fiona said, suddenly serious. "That's why I fell in love with you. You offered, but always left the choice to me." Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. Even after nearly 20 years together, Fiona still found herself moved by the depth of feeling she saw there. "Best choice I ever made," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Mine too," he replied simply. The next day, they put Alina on the eastbound train, their hearts full of both pride and sorrow. As the train pulled away, Ethan placed his arm around Fiona's shoulders. "She'll be back," he said with certainty. "How can you be so sure?" "Because we gave her roots as well as wings. This place." He gestured to the land beyond the station where their home waited. "It's part of her, just as it's part of us." They rode home in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached their gate, wider now than the original, but still bearing the careful craftsmanship of Ethan's hands, Fiona felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as Ethan dismounted to open the gate. "Staying here with me instead of continuing your travels?" Ethan looked at her, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Not for a single moment, even when I was difficult, when I insisted on doing things my own way," he laughed then, a warm sound that had become as essential to her as breathing. "Especially then. Your spirit is what I fell in love with, Fiona, your determination to live life on your own terms." "Our terms," she corrected, echoing words from long ago. "Our terms," he agreed. The house seemed quiet that evening without Alina's presence. After supper, they sat on the porch as was their custom, but there was a wistfulness to their conversation, a sense of ending and beginning intertwined. "I've been thinking," Fiona said after a while, "about the west pasture." Ethan raised an eyebrow, waiting. "We've had more people coming to stay recently, especially women with children. The house is getting crowded." "What are you suggesting?" Fiona hesitated, then plunged ahead. "A second house, perhaps, something more permanent than just rooms for travelers passing through. A place where people could stay longer, get back on their feet." Ethan considered this. "Like a boarding house, more like a haven, with gardens they could tend, skills they could learn." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Always thinking of ways to help others stand on their own." "Is it too ambitious?" Fiona asked, suddenly uncertain. "We're not as young as we once were." "We're not exactly ancient either," Ethan pointed out. "And we have friends who would help. Sarah and Thomas visit every summer. Jamie checks in whenever he's passing through with those horses of his." The more they discussed it, the more concrete the idea became not just a second house, but a true community within their boundaries. A place where independence was nurtured, where people could heal and grow strong. "We'll need to extend the fence," Ethan mused, his mind already working on the practicalities. "And add another well," Fiona added. They stayed up late that night, planning and dreaming as they hadn't done in years. By morning, what had begun as a vague idea had transformed into a vision they both believed in deeply. Over the next 2 years, their vision took shape. The second house was built, larger than their own, with a communal kitchen and individual rooms for residents. A workshop was added where various crafts could be taught and practiced. The garden was expanded significantly, with plots assigned to those who stayed. Word spread, as it always had, but now through more official channels as well. The new doctor in town referred patients who needed more than medical care. The sheriff, who had replaced the aging Marshal Collins, sent women and children who had nowhere else to go. Elena wrote regularly from Boston, her letters full of excitement about her studies and the new world she was discovering. "But I miss home," she confessed in every letter. "I miss the open sky and the fence around our land. I miss knowing exactly where I belong." "She'll come back," Ethan would say whenever he saw Fiona reading these letters with a wistful expression. "When she's ready." And in the spring of Eleanor's 3rd year away, she did come back not permanently, but for a visit that stretched from a planned 2 weeks into a full month. She brought with her medical knowledge that she shared freely with the residents, treating ailments and teaching basic nursing skills. "What you've created here," she told her parents as they walked the perimeter of the property one evening, "it's remarkable. There's nothing like it back east." "It wasn't planned," Fiona admitted. "It just grew from what we needed and then from what others needed." "Like a garden," Elena said thoughtfully. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "Exactly like that." As they reached the original gate, preserved even as the fence had been extended and improved, Elena stopped and placed her hand on the weathered wood. "I've been telling people about this place," she said. "Other medical students, professors. Some of them think similar havens could work in other places." Fiona and Ethan exchanged glances, surprised and touched by their daughter's pride in what they had built. "There's a doctor in Philadelphia," Elena continued, "who wants to establish a place for women recovering from illness who have nowhere to convalesce. She's asked if she could visit here, see how you've organized things." "Of course," Fiona said immediately. "Anyone who wants to learn is welcome." That summer, the doctor from Philadelphia did visit, as did 2 nurses from Chicago and a widow from St. Louis who had inherited property she wanted to use for something meaningful. Each visitor left with plans and ideas, inspired by what had grown from one woman's desire for independence and one man's commitment to supporting her vision. As their 30th anniversary approached, Fiona and Ethan found themselves at the center of a community that extended far beyond their fence. Former residents returned to visit, bringing stories of their new lives and often staying to help with the current group. Elena completed her medical training and established a practice in a growing city 50 miles away, close enough to visit regularly, far enough to build her own path. The fence remained, its purpose evolved but still essential. It marked the boundaries of their sanctuary, a visible reminder that what happened within was intentional, a choice to create safety without confinement, community without conformity. On the evening of their anniversary, the residents organized a celebration, a dinner under the stars with lanterns strung between trees, music from Jamie's fiddle, and tables laden with food from the gardens they all tended. As twilight deepened into night, Fiona and Ethan slipped away from the festivities, walking hand in hand to the spot where they had first met, her porch, where she had greeted him with suspicion and a rifle. 30 years, Ethan marveled, settling beside her on the swing that had replaced the old rocking chair. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times. Like we've always been here together," Fiona finished for him. He nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day, about the marshal sending me?" You said he was concerned, that there had been trouble moving through these parts, and that you might need an extra pair of hands to secure your property, Ethan added. I had no idea then what secure would come to mean. Fiona leaned against him, listening to the distant sounds of celebration from the main house. It means this, she said softly, all of this, not just the fence, but what it protects, what it allows to flourish. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Fiona thought about the journey they had taken from solitude to partnership, from self-sufficiency to community. The fence that Ethan had built around her land had never confined her. Instead, it had created the space where she could grow beyond her own boundaries, reaching out to others without losing herself. I love you, Ethan Daniels, she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. Thank you for building a fence around my land and calling it safe. I love you, Fiona Daniels, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for letting me in. Above them, stars filled the vast Texas sky, eternal witnesses to the story of a woman who had lived alone on the edge of town, and the cowboy who had seen not her isolation, but her strength. The fence they had built together stood firm around their land, not as a barrier, but as a gateway to the life they had chosen together.